Stavo domandando, Trambali, mi dai la parola tu?
Subito. Sì. Okay. Faccio una brevissima presentazione e poi passo la parola.
Bene.
Ok, abbiamo impostato il live su Facebook, 1 minuto e siamo live anche sul sito di Med. E partiamo.
Anyway, I don't like this. I participate to several webinars as a guest, but this is my first experience as a chair. It's a mess. I don't like it.
It will be a success.
I'm a 20th century man at the end of the day.
Please close your microphone for 1 minute.
I believe we should start. I'm not quite sure in this virtual live, but if nothing will stop me, I will try to start our meeting. Good afternoon, everybody in Europe and in Amman. Good morning, Washington, D.C. Thank you to here with us. I'm Ugo Tambali, Senior Advisor of ISPI, the Italian Institute for International Political Studies, and columnist with the Italian economic newspaper Il Sole 24 Ore. I'm very happy to open this event in cooperation with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and ISPI. Allow me to thank the Ministry for its active participation and support. This event is part of a series of virtual panels we are organizing ahead of the 6th edition of Rome Med Dialogues, which will be held next December from between 3rd and 5th of December. In flesh and blood, we hope, but among many other aspects of our life, the pandemic has also disrupted our way of working. And I'm afraid for many extent, this is gonna be our new normal for a long time. This is why the Rome Med Dialogue adjusted itself by giving life to a series of virtual panels, dialogue, and virtual regional meeting until December, making Med a true long year initiative. Before to start our session and to introduce our panelists, it's my pleasure to give the floor to the Deputy Minister of the Italian Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, Marina Sereni. Madam, please.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to take part in this debate on such a topical theme. I am sure that this moment of dialogue and exchange with prominent experts on this field will provide a fruitful room of opportunity to better understand the latest development on the Middle East peace process. After a long period in which seemed to have fallen into oblivion because of other hotter crises, such as the Libyan and the Syrian one, the Israeli-Palestinian issue has recently regained the attention of the international community after the Trump administration unveiled the so-called Vision for Peace. Since then, we are witnessing a renewed interest towards the peace process, whose solution remains a key for the future of the entire region and Middle East. The Italian position is unchanged. We support a negotiated solution. Just to give an answer to our title, the title of this webinar, we support a negotiated solution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that should take into due consideration the legitimate aspirations and needs of both parties, and that should lead to a just, viable and sustainable two-state solution based on international parameters and in accordance with international law. This is easier to say, it's not easier to do. As we all know, international attention is now focused on the perspective of Israeli unilateral annexation on portions of the West Bank, whose process could be initiated on summertime, starting from July the 1st. In this regard, we have expressed grave concerns on the prospect of Israeli unilateral annexations. If implemented, such steps would constitute a clear breach of the international law and risk to seriously undermine any possibility to resume dialogue with the Palestinians and to jeopardize the viability of the two-state perspective. But it would also be detrimental for Israel's state security, which remains a priority for Italy and would endanger regional stability. We are thus worried for the announcement by the Palestinian Authority to suspend all agreements signed with Israel and the US, also in the security sector, and the consequent possibility of social unrest. Moreover, we have to take into due consideration the signals coming from the Arab world, which are more and more clear and worrisome. The warnings launched by Jordan and Egypt, which I want to underline, are the only two Arab states to have signed a peace agreement with Israel, thus guaranteeing a long period of peace and stability in the region. The recent positions expressed by Emirates and Saudi Arabia, warnings from Turkey, and even the unacceptable threats of Iran. All these factors may trigger a dangerous spiral of violence in the Middle East. The potential destabilizing effects of such unilateral initiatives have sparked a strong debate within Israel itself, also in the light of other impelling challenges, such as COVID-19 pandemic and the necessity, the urgent economic problems of the country. Moreover, within the government coalition, there are different sensitiveness on how and when to eventually proceed with a growing group of cautious positions, starting from alternate Prime Minister Gantz and Foreign Minister Ashkenazi, in order not to endanger relations with Jordan and other Arab states. On the other hand, we are witnessing a growing internal debate on the issues of annexations, also in the United States, whereas a solid bipartisan support would be extremely important for Israel. Washington's stance is obviously crucial for its leverage on the Israeli counterparts, and that is why we are having a constant dialogue with our American friends to explore the possibility to convince Israelis to adopt a more cautious approach. The EU and the member states are doing their utmost to avert the perspective of annexation. Our shared goal is preventing unilateral moves before it is too late. To do so, we are conducting a very intensive outreach campaign with all the major actors involved, starting from Israel, which remains a strategic partner for us and with whom we aim to continue at deepening our relations. At the same time, we have been calling on Israel to refrain from any unilateral step. It is not a secret, and I conclude with this, that in Europe we have different positions and there is no unanimity. Nevertheless, almost all member states agree on the fact that annexations are illegal under international law and could destabilize the region. I am aware that a lot of people, and surely those who are participating in this debate today, are questioning on possible European reactions in case of annexations. For the time being, I can only say that there are too many variables to make predictions. That is why we have to continue engaging with all relevant parties to explore the space to resume direct talks with the final aim of just and viable two-state solutions that can assure peace, stability, and prosperity for all. Israeli and Palestinians are facing an historical crossroad. Our hope is that they will both act with a spirit of compromise and vision, choosing the right path to achieve this ultimate, long-awaited and urgent goal. Thank you.
Start our meeting, our discussion. And 29 years ago at the Madrid conference and 2 years later at the White House for the signing of the Oslo Accords. By the way, I was, in my previous life as a journalist, I was both in Spain and in DC at that time. We were not supposed to be at this point, but today, to a new Israeli annexation. What went wrong? And most compelling now, what would be the consequence of annexation? And how would the US administration react? And what could the European Union do to prevent or react to such a move? And how could the relation between Israel and the Arab world evolve? And last but not least at all, would Bibi Netanyahu start, postpone, reduce, or cancel the annexation? With my unquestionable power as a chairman today, just for just a little time, I proudly state that our panel today is a parterre de roi on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, kings, of course, socially distanced. Let me introduce first Dr. Marwan Mouasher, Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment, former Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Hashemite Kingdom, and Senior Vice President at the World Bank. Ambassador Dennis Ross, Counselor, and William Davidson Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. And let me say, as a negotiator, Ambassador Ross was the US Mr. Oslo for 4 presidents, both Democrats and Republicans. And Hugh Lowett, Policy Fellow of the Middle East Program at the as the European Council of Foreign Relations, with an important say on the European role in the Palestinian-Israeli cauldron. You are free to answer any of my previous 5 questions, the consequence of annexation, US administration, European Union, Israeli-Arab relations, what Bibi will do starting with July 1st. You are free to answer whatever you want. In the first round, I will give you about 8 minutes and at least 5 more on the second one. Then we will try to collect some questions for our virtual audience. Dr. Mouasher, Faddal, please.
Thank you very much, Ugo, and thank you for this opportunity. Lots of questions, but let me start with the Oslo process. What is Oslo? Let us remind ourselves, what was Oslo supposed to achieve? Oslo was supposed to be a 5-year-old process in which a Palestinian National Authority would be established in parts of the West Bank and Gaza. And 2 years into that, final status negotiations were supposed to start and end in 3 years. So in 5 years, we were supposed to come to a solution of the Arab-Israeli conflict. What happened instead was, of course, we are 27 years since Oslo was signed in 1993. The number of settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem has mushroomed from 250,000 in 93 to 650,000 today. already the prospects of a two-state solution are very bleak, not just because of the lack of political will to achieve that solution, but because of demographics. I mean, how do you separate the two communities when you have 650,000 settlers, 250,000 of which are in East Jerusalem? Annexation is going to, if, I'm one of the people who have argued for a while that the two-state solution is over anyway, that there is no possibility of affecting at least a viable two-state solution that is sustainable and acceptable by both sides. But annexation is going to kill once and for all any prospects of a two-state solution. And in that, and if that is to happen, then it's going to endanger not just the interests of the Palestinians, but for my own country, Jordan, it's going to endanger Jordanian interests as well. I want to remind us all of why Jordan went to the peace process in the first place. Our principal objective behind going to the peace process and behind signing a peace treaty with Israel is to end the Israeli occupation and establish a Palestinian state. This is not rhetoric. Establishing a Palestinian state on Palestinian soil is a direct interest of Jordan, not just the Palestinians, because it will bury once and for all, those who argue that Jordan is Palestine and we can establish a Palestinian state in Jordan. Today, we are left with a situation where Israel clearly does not want a two-state solution in the West Bank and Gaza. And if they also don't want, and you would assume they don't, a Palestinian majority in areas under Israel's control. Today, if you count the number of Palestinian Arabs in Israel proper, in the West Bank and East Jerusalem and in Gaza, the number, according to official Israeli statistics, is 6.6 million people. Compared to 6.5 million Israeli Jews, you have a number 400,000, Israelis who are non-Jews, non-Arabs. So today, the Palestinians are a plurality in areas under Israel's control. And if you assume that Israel is not interested in keeping a Palestinian plurality in areas under its control, otherwise it's an apartheid system, then Jordan fears that if a Palestinian state is not established in the West Bank and Gaza, that Israel is going to somehow either create or make use of conditions under which a large number of Palestinians would end up in Jordan. We used to say before, this is not a possibility in today's age. After the Syrian crisis, no one says that anymore. With Syria, 6.5 million people left Syria in less than 6 months. So it is not impossible to create or make use of conditions under which such mass expulsion will take place. And that's Jordan's main fear. If Israel goes ahead with annexation, it will both kill a two-state solution, but it will also endanger Jordanian security as well.
Thank you, Dr. Marshall. Ambassador Ross, it's your turn.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I must say I agree with much of what Marwan said, but I'd like to make a few points to create a bit more context for our discussion and also address at least some of the questions you asked about what's going on within Israel. Let me start by saying we have to understand that the peace camp in Israel has largely been killed. It's the only way to put it. You had the second Intifada, which followed what was probably the most forthcoming government in Israel's history in terms of what they were prepared to accept. And the answer to what was the Clinton parameters, which would have created a viable, credible Palestinian state, which was rejected by Yasser Arafat. The answer to that was to produce a second Intifada in which around 4,000 Palestinians died, around 1,100 Israelis died. And the view of most in the Israeli peace camp was pretty much decimated within the Israeli body politic. If that didn't do it, you add to it an additional withdrawal from southern Lebanon, withdrawal from Gaza, each followed not by security or peace, but by, in a sense, more violence and rockets. So the manifestation of the peace camp being killed in Israel is that in 2015, you had an election. We had 3 elections in the last year, 2019, 2020. The opposition didn't mention the word peace because they would look to be naive to the Israeli body politic. So that's a context that has been created. In that context, we find ourselves with the Israeli public disbelieving that peace in 2 states is possible, but we also have the Palestinian public disbelieving that peace in 2 states is possible. The challenge for real diplomacy is to somehow find a way to restore that sense of belief and possibility. I do agree that unilateral annexation is something that makes the prospect of 2 states, if not very low, close to impossible. Because I think we're getting to a point, this is what Marwan was getting at, we're getting to a point where even separating Israelis from Palestinians, which makes 2 states possible, it becomes increasingly unlikely if there is annexation, number one. Number 2, among Palestinians, there needs to be a serious effort at reform to build institutions. So if they had a state, it wouldn't be a failed state. So this is kind of the broad context in which we find ourselves. So why is it that Prime Minister Netanyahu is so determined, at least seemingly, to press ahead with annexation? Well, he sees a unique opportunity from his standpoint. He sees the Trump plan, which would provide Israel roughly 30% of the West Bank. He sees it as a unique opportunity to change the baseline internationally, to create a legacy for himself, and to, in a sense, if there is ever negotiations in the future, to have the baseline not basically June 467 or June 467 and mutually agreed swaps, but instead roughly 70% of the West Bank. He believes that the risk that is being run in doing this is minimal. He thinks the threats of the Palestinian Authority collapsing aren't real because the leaders of the Palestinian Authority benefit too much from having it. Such threats have been made before. He believes that Jordan, when the king talks about massive conflict, doesn't really have much of an alternative. Its economic situation is bleak. It depends heavily on the Trump administration, the American administration for assistance. It's not going to abrogate the agreement. Arabs in the rest of the region aren't engaging in increasing cooperation, at least below the table with Israel as a favor to Israel, but because they need it, given the threats they see. The European Union won't inflict or impose sanctions because there won't be unanimity to impose it. And he thinks all this will somehow blow over. My own view is he's wrong on 2 counts. The gains that he sees in terms of changing the baseline, I think, are illusory. First, the rest of the world isn't going to recognize this new baseline. And if there's a change in administration here, granted, if Trump wins a 2nd term, that his gamble, and I'll use the term gamble, could prove to be a better gamble, meaning more of a chance. But if there is a change in administration, a Biden administration is likely to reverse the recognition that the Trump administration offers. Plus, I think the risks. I think the prospect that the PA could collapse, I think is not minimal. Maybe it won't, but if it is, from an Israeli standpoint, that's a disaster for Israel. It's true that Jordan is unlikely to abrogate the peace treaty, but if it feels the need to suspend it, that's a terrible precedent to establish. And I do believe the king is under significant pressure, in no small part for the reasons that Marwan was outlining. In terms of the other Arab states, maybe they won't change what they're doing below the table, but the prospect of putting things on top of the table in the open, I think are quite minimal. And I think the fact that there will be some European states, not the EU, but some European states that would recognize a Palestinian state on the 67 lines in response to annexation will cement the old baseline that Prime Minister Netanyahu wants to replace. So the question then becomes is, what are the prospects that this could be stopped? that it won't happen. The key is, does the Trump administration say no? In the coalition agreement of the new government, the one thing they agreed as a condition was that the Trump administration had to accept the annexation. Now, the administration has sent one signal, which is that it wants there to be agreement on the Israeli side between Netanyahu and Gantz and Ashkenazi. And that likely is going to affect the scope of annexation, not necessarily the totality, not necessarily the principle of annexation. So rather than 30%, maybe it's 3%. Maybe it's only within areas that would be part of Israel in any peace proposal that's been made prior to the Trump administration. Maybe they'll frame it in a way to say, look, this isn't designed to preclude negotiations. But at this point, we're not seeing any sign that the administration is going to say no. What could change that? Well, one, if the Palestinians would engage on the Trump plan and offer a counterproposal. Offering counterproposals has never been part of the Palestinian DNA. Up until now, they haven't. They didn't offer a counterproposal to the Clinton parameters. They didn't offer a counterproposal to what Olmert offered. They didn't offer a counterproposal to, or even a response to what President Obama offered on March 17, 2014. So the fact that they're unlikely to offer a counterproposal to a plan that they don't want to in any way legitimize shouldn't surprise us. But that the administration is sending signals to the Palestinians that they will say no to annexation if the Palestinians will engage. As I said, unlikely. Maybe others could engage. Maybe Arab states could come to the administration and say, look, we can't bring the Palestinians down, but if you stop annexation, we'll be prepared to engage on the Trump plan because it has regional implications. That might be enough to get the administration to say no to annexation, simply because I think the administration has a stake in trying to vindicate the imagery of their plan and look for some foreign policy success. The points I'm outlining are obviously in the realm of possibility, but I can't give them a high probability at this point. I think the prospect of Gantz and Ashkenazi stopping the annexation is probably limited. Netanyahu is already threatening, in effect, that if they won't go along and create a consensus for the Trump administration, that he'd go to elections. If that's a bluff, it may be one that's seen as credible to Gantz and Ashkenazi. I do think the Europeans can continue to weigh in and make it clear what they see the consequences are. And I think everyone who believes in preserving two states as at least an option needs to make it very clear what they see the consequences are. I'll just conclude with one thought, and Marwan touched on this. It's not in Israel's interest to have a one state for two peoples outcome, because that's basically the end of Israel as a Jewish democratic state. And so the more that theme can be emphasized and the risks associated with it can be emphasized, the more that may yet affect things in Israel. But at this point, I would say the key lies in the hands of the Trump administration. And unless their posture becomes more clear in terms of saying no, I'm afraid we're going to see at least some form of annexation, even if it's more limited than what's being talked about. You're muted.
My mistake, 20th century man. Euro, I was saying. Hugh, what do you think about the European behavior on this issue?
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Let me first just start by picking up a bit of what we said, just to underscore, I think, the point that we're at. I think it's clear that the Middle East peace process, at least as it was configured since Oslo, has been dysfunctional for quite some time. And for quite some time, the two-state solution has been on a life support system. And we should, of course, acknowledge that there's faults on both sides. But of course, at the same time, I think it's quite clear that the chief culprit for why we're here at this moment in time is largely, Israel's policy of creeping annexation and erosion of the territorial footprint for a viable two-state solution. But, as we've heard, I think it's quite clear also that formal annexation will propel us into a new paradigm. That paradigm may not be totally clear at present, but it's quite clear some of the contours. And I think it's quite clear that it will be increasingly centered on sort of a one-state reality if two states no longer becomes possible. And I think increasing calls for equal rights, at least from Palestinians. And I think it's also quite clear the consequences that will come with this shift of paradigm. And this is perhaps not the time or the place to go into all of those details, but clearly it will have implications not just for Palestinian self-determination, but as we heard from Ambassador Ross, also it will have implications for Israel's future as a democratic and majority Jewish state. And I say that to really underscore the seriousness of the point we're at. And I think given how serious this point is, I think this is a moment that is deserving of the EU and its member states investing their time and political capital to try to avert what we collectively know is awaiting down the road. And again, as the point has been repeatedly made, I don't think formal annexation is a done deal. Clearly, the Israeli government is still weighing up the pros and cons, and the Trump administration will still have its say in the matter. But I think from the EU perspective, it's quite clear also that that the EU's response should not be just to sit back and hope that it will work itself out at some point. I think that the response should be to assume that we do have and we can play a significant political role in averting and deterring formal annexation. And should that annexation happens, I think the EU will also have an important role to help shape the new paradigm that will come after this. That, as I said, is still, I think, slowly emerging. So I suppose the question is, what can the EU do? And I would kind of separate that into two components. There's the deterrence, and then there's the response. And clearly there's some overlap in both of them. But obviously at the moment the focus is on deterrence, and we have heard, I think to the EU's credit, the level for consensus has been higher than perhaps some people, myself included, would have imagined a few months ago. Perhaps with one exception, I think all member states are clear that annexation is wrong and detrimental. Of course, it has escaped no one's attention that there are divisions, nonetheless, about how the EU should articulate that opposition. But I do want to say also that this idea about, the EU can't do anything because there's no consensus, I think that's a bit of a myth. Clearly, the lack of unanimity amongst the now 27 member states is a major obstacle. But that doesn't mean there won't be any reaction, whether by the EU as a whole or by its member states individually or in groups. And when one's looking at the response, I think, again, part of that is going to be in terms of the EU having to assume and enforce its own principles and its own policy positions and its own domestic rule of law, which itself is based on international law. And I think this will have clear and continued implications on the EU's relationship, not just with the settlements, which are still sometimes included in the EU's bilateral relations with Israel, but it also risks having deeper implications for the EU-Israel relationship itself. And so, I think an important part of deterrence is to already start to spell out what some of these consequences could be. It doesn't mean that these will be the consequences, but I think the EU and its member states should do more to actually start framing what are some of the dilemmas. And we've heard it from the EU High Representative Josep Borrell and from other member states, that annexation cannot go unopposed. So I think now is the moment to start articulating what that opposition would actually look like. As I said, I think that's an important part of deterrence, but also a responsible thing to do in terms of preparing responses if Israel does carry through with its annexation. And I won't go into too much detail, but I think, as I said, I think part of that response is stuff that the EU should have been doing 10 years ago. Whether it's recognition of a Palestinian state or doing more to ensure the full and effective non-recognition of Israeli settlement entities and activities from the EU-Israel relationship, and also the relationship between Israel and the member states. So I think that's an important point. Doing more to support international accountability mechanisms, which, let's be quite frank, I think many member states have been lukewarm about at some point, and some occasions even trying to block. I think that has done a disservice to everyone. And I think the result of the reason we are here in part is, I think, a lack of deterrence and response to Israeli policies in the occupied territories that violate international law. Of course, that's not the only reason, but I think we have to recognize that is a main reason. And I think the second bit of the EU response should be, of course, things that are perhaps more in terms of one would recognize as restrictive measures. So, which parts of the current EU-Israel relationship should be reviewed and perhaps suspended. This is a difficult conversation, but I think everything needs to be on the table and to be reviewed. And, I think, I'm framing this very much as a short, sort of a near-term response. But clearly, if annexation moves forward, the dilemma of how to proceed with EU-Israel relationships the EU-Israel relationship will only grow. So what is the continued logic and motivating factor for continuing to grow relations with Israel in a situation where hypothetically 2 states is no longer possible, and you hear Palestinians and increasing number of Europeans themselves in parliament and in the public calling Israel an apartheid state. Now, I understand these are difficult and emotional and charged things to say, but that is the trajectory we're going under. So there will inevitably be pressure on this EU-Israel relationship, and there will inevitably be a need to come up with a new logic for the EU-Israel relationship going forward if 2 states is no longer possible. And I'll finish very briefly in saying, clearly there also will have to be a reflection about the continued EU-PA-PLO relationship. I don't have an answer for that. I think, at this moment, I think clearly, as the Deputy Foreign Minister said, there's many variables, but I think a lot of the components of that relationship will also need to be thought through going forward. And my final point is, while we may not know the full paradigm that we're entering into over the coming months and years, I fear, the EU should lay down clear markers. It's not for the EU to say whether 2 states is possible or not. I think largely that depends on Palestinians and Palestinians deciding on how to fulfill their self-determination. But the EU can nevertheless help, frame that debate. I think it's clear that going forward, it should be based on international law. But I think the EU should also, and I'll finish with this point, be very clear that of course it prefers a 2-state solution as the best and most optimal means of ensuring equal rights for both people. But I think it needs to be equally clear that if 2 states is no longer possible, then the only other way of achieving equal rights for both people will be in a 1-state solution, no matter how difficult that is. Because I think the alternative is to say, well, is to acquiesce and to accept, sort of an open-ended reality, a sort of 1-state reality of unequal rights for Palestinians under continued occupation. That's the EU's language. Other people would call that apartheid. So I think that, the EU will need to think seriously over the coming weeks and months about how it responds not just to annexation, but how it responds to the unraveling of the Middle East peace process and 2-state solution.
Thank you. Marwan, in my opinion, following the peace process, that in this story there is one thing is pretty clear. We have an occupier and we have an occupied. But at the same time, on my opinion, I believe that Palestinians made, from Abu Ammar to Abu Mazen, they made huge mistakes. But this is my opinion. It's not important. I want to have your own opinion about the Palestinian mistakes.
Look, everybody made mistakes. I mean, if you want to list the mistakes that people did, they don't belong to one faction. And this is well documented in the literature. I think what Hugh said is very, very, very important. The question to the EU and to the international community is not what it will do if Israel goes ahead with annexation. Dennis already laid out that if Israel does annexation, the international pressure is not going to be much, and in the end, annexation will stand, no matter what international law says. The question to the EU is not what it will do in 4 weeks or 6 weeks or a year. The question is what it will do in 10 years, when the Palestinians, no longer able to have their own state, are going to clearly say, we want equal rights. If we cannot have our own state, we want equal rights in the state we live under. And what is the EU going to say to the Palestinians? No to a state and no to equal rights? That means yes to apartheid. Already in the United States, public opinion is, I forgot the exact number, but there's a majority, maybe 70% of Americans say that if there is no two states, they are for equal rights. This is the question that we have to tackle. We already are in a one-state reality. It might not be a one-state solution, but it is a one-state reality, whether people like it or not. And that one-state reality is a reality where the Palestinians already are a majority. We're not talking about a point in the future. So in 10 or 15 years' time, when the Palestinians become 60% or 65% of the population, what is Israel going to say? We are going to have an apartheid system indefinitely? That's not something that the international community will accept. I'm afraid that, and you know, I am a two-stater. Please don't get me wrong. I spent most of my professional life working for a two-state solution. But if we keep hanging on to a solution that does not exist and has no possibility to be implemented, all what we are doing is giving Israel more excuses to take more of the land, as they have been doing already. I think the international community, as Hugh said, needs to understand that we are entering a new paradigm. And that paradigm is shifting the focus from one that focuses on the shape of a solution to one that focuses on equal rights. That is the shift that is happening already in the West Bank. If you talk to the people, to the young generation in the West Bank, yes, a majority want a two-state solution, but a majority also do not think that solution is possible. And there is an increasing plurality in the West Bank calling for a one-state solution. This is taboo by the international community so far. You know, nobody wants to talk about the one-state solution because they say it's very difficult to implement. I claim it is less difficult to implement than the two-state solution today, which has become impossible. So if people don't want a one-state solution, they better be more serious about stopping Israel from annexation, rather than just coming up with, you know, rhetorical statements against annexation while allowing Israel to go ahead with it. Annexation is going to be dangerous to everybody, but most of all, it's going to be dangerous to Israel, which no longer will be able to, you know, claim that it is a Jewish or a democratic state. That is over if a two-state solution is not effective.
Thank you. Ambassador Ross, allow me to make a sort of a parallel question for the American diplomacy. Don't you think that if we reach this point today is also because for some mistake of the American diplomacy? I'm not saying, of course, about this the family plan, the Trump family plan, talking about since the beginning of Oslo. Don't you think that the American diplomacy was all the time much more careful to the Israeli needs and demands than the Palestinian one?
You know, I actually don't believe that was the case. Were we taking into account the Israeli needs? Of course we were. Were we taking into account the Palestinian needs? Yes, we were. You know, you look at the Clinton parameters. The Clinton parameters were not offered in isolation. Both sides came to us and asked us to make a bridging proposal. We would not have made a bridging proposal unless being asked. We made an effort to address the needs of both sides. And unfortunately, Yasser Arafat rejected it. We can get into why he rejected it. You know, he had a narrative that he was getting messages from the incoming Bush administration and he would get a better deal from them. I don't believe that. I think that was revisionist talk, but that point is he rejected it. And you can't say, I won't say that the Trump peace plan meets the needs of both sides, but the previous efforts did meet the needs of both sides. Do we have a special relationship with Israel, the United States? Yes, we do. But I don't think you can say that what we proposed in the end was something that didn't take account of the needs of both sides. So I think it's easy to say the U.S. was too supportive of Israel. I might also say the flip side of that was the EU. one thing the U.S. has done in the past, the U.S. has tried to beat both sides, but the U.S. has been prepared to be critical of both sides. I think one thing that would help, the EU obviously supports the Palestinians, and that's fine and acceptable and legitimate, but it should also be prepared to be publicly critical, not just privately critical, when the Palestinians act in a way that ultimately doesn't serve their own interests. You know, as I was suggesting, the Palestinians could have had a state already if they had accepted the Clinton parameters, if they accepted what Olmert offered, if they accepted what was available from President Obama. Each of these proposals not only didn't draw a counter proposal, in some cases it didn't even draw a response. So, you know, we have a conflict where both sides have contributed to the conflict. Both sides bear a lot of responsibility for why there isn't a resolution of it. I think the question becomes now an issue that Marwan is raising. The book that I have out now is one that basically accepts that if Israel stays on the path it's on, it becomes one state for two people, which is in a sense the end of what was the Zionist mission, the Zionist ethic, which was to create a Jewish democratic state. I would like to see us focus as well on, is there something more that can be done to head off annexation now? Because I do fear the consequences of annexation. I do think, I was saying before, maybe Arab states can go to the administration and say, we're prepared, we have criticisms of the Trump plan, but we're prepared to offer our own thoughts on how it could be improved. So we'll be engaging on it to give the Trump administration an excuse to say no. As I said, the Palestinians won't engage, even though that would be a way out. Maybe it's possible also for the quartet, meaning the EU with the UN and the Russians, to say, for now, we will engage in the Trump plan, again, presenting what they consider counter-proposals or alternatives to it, to give the Trump administration and a pretext to say, look, we have engagement on the plan. So long as there is engagement on the plan, there shouldn't be any annexation. The administration, when they presented the proposal, the president said there's a 4-year window. I don't know what the rush is to go ahead and have annexation if there's a 4-year window for the Palestinians, but we should be also thinking about what is it that could be done, including by the EU and members of the quartet or the Arab quartet, to engage with the administration in a way that gives it an excuse. I would say this administration right now probably would like to have something it could point to that would be a success. So maybe we should be collectively thinking about what might be done to give them a reason to tell the Israelis not to go ahead with annexation.
Sure. Hugh, Lovat, when Russia occupied or annexed Crimea, the European Union made very strong economic sanctions. For symmetrically, we should impose the same kind of tough economic sanction also to Israel in case of annexation. But don't you think that Russia for Europe is not exactly Israel? I mean, Europe is the place, the European culture and the Christianity are where the sources of the anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. Do you think it would be easy for the European to impose the same kind of a tough economic or political sanction to Israel?
Well, clearly it's not easy for the EU. I mean, we can see the current discussion as it is and the reluctance with which the EU and its member states are having the discussion about possible responses to annexation, and contrast that to the rapidity and the eagerness in which the EU proceeded to put restrictive measures on Russia following the annexation. So clearly, clearly the relationship with Israel is fundamentally different from our relationship with Russia. As you said, our relationship with Israel is based on friendship and cooperation, and it's often what is missed is just how deep that relationship with Israel is and continues to expand. So clearly the starting point is completely different. But I think this links up to something that is much broader than just the narrow confines of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And it's clearly about the international rules-based order, which matters, for the US, it matters for the EU, it matters for the member states. and upholding this international prohibition on the acquisition of occupied territory, I think is of paramount importance to the international order itself. You mentioned Crimea, but it's no secret also China and other countries harbor territorial ambitions. So I think this is something that member states in the EU see as something being incredibly important, especially some Eastern member states who are closer to Russia and are clearly afraid of Russia's old ambitions in that part of the world. So I think the EU, is in a position where it, of course, and let's be quite frank, it doesn't want to take measures against Israel. No government wants to do that, but it's in a position where it's being compelled to do so for a variety of reasons, which we talked about two states and the fate of both Israelis and Palestinians, but also about the fate of the international order and upholding that. So I think that's the broader answer. I don't think we'll see the same level of measures that were imposed against Russia over Crimea. We won't see that same level imposed in this case against Israel. But I think the question is, how close, if at all, can the EU get to replicating and to at least say, we've put our foot down, and that there is some cost for annexation, and there is some cost that comes with, violating the UN's founding charter.
For instance?
So there's the differentiation stuff I talked about excluding the settlements from bilateral relations, which I don't think should be a response to annexation. That's something that should have happened 10 years ago. It's another discussion, but clearly in doing it, that can create some dilemmas for the Israeli government in terms of, confronting the Israeli government with the dilemma of expanding a settlement enterprise that's not recognized by the EU and most of the international community, while at the same time deepening its relations. So basically underscoring that you can't do both at the same time. And for now, Israel has been able to do both at the same time. Then there's a second basket of measures, which I talked about a bit earlier, which is sort of the more restrictive measures. And I think we should look at let's put the full spectrum of bilateral relations with Israel on the table, the association agreement, the agreements that have sprung from that in terms of the community cooperation programs, research and development programs, twinning projects, funding and loans that the EU sends to Israel, so on and so forth. I think this should all be on the table. It doesn't mean we take everything off the table and this is not about severing relations with Israel. I think the question is about, what is an appropriate and robust enough EU response that is in line with previous responses such as Crimea, and also in line with EU law and international law.
Thank you. Now we have some question for our audience without name. Let me read 3 questions. Do you actually think annexation will happen in July, or is it just Netanyahu's strategy to distract the public opinion from the main problem of the country, which currently is its economic situation? What is Moscow's stance about the annexation, and from which country we could expect an harder approach toward Israel? Isn't time to start talking about a one-state solution, and therefore what kind of state it needs to be? I mean, 2 questions, we have at least 4 questions. Marwan, Fadal.
I do think Netanyahu will go ahead with annexation. As Dennis said also, he wants to make use of the Trump plan. He wants to make use of the fact that Trump is today in power. Who knows what happens in November? He sees in this a golden opportunity to go ahead with it and to, of course, in the process, distract attention from his own political problems at home. I think the question is going to be how much annexation does he do? Does he do 30% or does he do less? My own guess is he will do less, but let me add that from, for example, Jordan's perspective, it's not the size of annexation that matters. The very fact that he is ready to do annexation points to the fact that he is not serious about the 2-state solution. And if he's not serious about the 2-state solution, then we see this as a threat to both the Palestinians and to Jordan. So I'm not as concerned with the size of annexation. I think whatever he does is going to be extremely problematic. As I said a while before, yes, I do think we are moving to a one-state paradigm. A one-state paradigm is not a monolithic term. You have the liberal the liberal approach, which means one person, one vote, which is something that Israel will never accept to. But there are other forms. You have the federal form, for example, where you have the one person, one vote in two entities, but that are part of the same state. In other words, if separation is no longer viable, and I don't think it is viable, then you have to move to integration. If you cannot separate the two communities, then you integrate them in one way or the other. There is no escaping this fact, unless Israel, as I said, unless Israel succeeds in expelling a large number of Palestinians out of its territories into Jordan, primarily, unless it does that, then Israel itself will not be able to escape the reality 20 or 30 years from now. Once again, if people are serious about the two-state solution, they better move now, because things are not getting any better in 5 years or 10 years. The number of settlers are increasing. The political climate in Israel is hardline. The Palestinians are weak and divided. We're not going to get a better environment for a two-state solution in 5 years or 10 years. If it's not done now, then the paradigm will shift on its own, whether we like it or not.
Thank you. Ambassador Ross, I would like to follow up with the questions I read before, adding Russia. I mean, Russia is very compelling, important for Israel, much more than before. Russia is important for Israel regarding Syria and Iran. So Israel needs to listen to Putin. What do you think about that?
Well, I think if the Russians had a clear position on this, it might be helpful. They seem to have a formulaic position on this, more in the form of a slogan as opposed to adopting what might be a very clear-cut position. We've seen the Russians, I think they would like to take part in the broader peace process per se, but we've not seen Putin make much of an effort, because Putin tends to want to focus on those things where he can succeed, not where he would fail. So their position continues to be kind of out there, but not expressed in a very dramatic way, and certainly not in a way that translates. I want to reinforce something that Marwan said. I too think we are at an inflection point. I too am worried about what happens if we lose the possibility of two states. I think we have to understand, if we say, I think Marwan put it well, he said a one-state paradigm. He didn't say a one-state solution. One state is not a solution. One state is a prescription for an enduring conflict. We're not in the post-nationalistic phase of the Middle East. You still have two peoples with two national identities. You put them into one state, and we've seen what happened in the Middle East, where we have states that have more than one identity, national, ethnic, or tribal. They tend to be states that are in enduring conflict. We shouldn't want that. So there needs to be a recognition that if we lose the possibility of having two states, it's not like we have an alternative that looks like it's going to be a highly peaceful one. I very much doubt that.
Sure. Hugh. Whatever you want, I mean, regarding the questions for the audience.
As I said, I think, it's not, clearly, as I said earlier, we're going into a new paradigm, and I don't think it's really for the EU to come up with all the answers, and we shouldn't, and I think we should have a lot of humility. And as I said, I think I agree with what the other participants said, that clearly there is no easy or viable alternative to the current two-state solution, and this new paradigm is something that won't be resolved tomorrow. I mean, I fear this will be another generational struggle. But there was one point, I mean, I'm going to be very badly behaved and actually pick up a point that was said a bit earlier about, and because there is a conversation that's happening in the Quartet and the EU, and it's having this conversation, or EU member states having this conversation with Palestinians and the Americans about, and Ambassador Ross talked about this, should the Palestinians present another plan or their own counter proposal? I think this is important because this is something that's been talked about. And I would say, firstly, Israel hasn't presented a plan. It's the Americans that presented a plan for themselves. So I think there's a question mark about why we, the EU should be pushing the Palestinians to come up with their own proposal at this point in time, especially if the implication is that we want them to soften their starting positions, especially at a time when, you know, the Israeli government cannot even say the words two-state solution. So I think that's an important point that I really wanted to underscore going forward, because I know this is something that is being reflected. But certainly if the EU or the Arab states want to come up with something, then ahlan wa sahlan. But my final point on that is, what do we mean when we say we want a counter proposal? Ambassador Ross talked about you know, the Clinton parameters. I mean, we already know what a two-state solution looks like because we have the Clinton parameters. They may not be perfect, but they give us you know, a very good outline, and they've been refined over successive negotiation processes. We have the Geneva Initiative from 2003 that actually came up with a map. So I don't think, you know, we can continuously reinvent the wheel. We know what two states looks like. I think the question is whether both sides, in this case, especially Israel, can actually sign up to that vision, to the vision of two states based on 67 lines with limited land swaps, et cetera, et cetera. If Israel, and let's be fair, you know, let's be frank, Israel is blocking at the moment, you know, because it can't say that. And so unless we can actually change that context, then, you know, then I don't understand, I don't see why or where a process for the sake of process can actually lead anywhere meaningful. So I think, to finish on this, I think it's much more about, if we want to avoid the coming paradigm, is how do we change the current context and the cost benefit calculation on the Israeli side, and how do we adapt and help rectify Palestinian weaknesses, which we're all very aware of.
Thank you. We have a few more questions from the public. How will annexation of the West Bank affect the Gaza Strip? And other than EU, who else can put pressures on Israel and induce the desired behavior from Israel? And are there any factors in Israel domestic politics that then can make differences? Hugh, I would start with you again.
Sure. So on, so I think Gaza, I'm glad that was mentioned, because, you know, I think often now Gaza is forgotten. And I think there's the answer about Gaza is twofold. I mean, there's a question about what happens to Gaza after annexation. And I think there more than ever, you know, it's important that we don't forget about it. And if Palestinians or others start talking about equal rights, that it's not just equal rights for Palestinians in annexed territories or in the West Bank, that actually Gazans are kept part of that. The second bit of the conversation is, you know, what can be done kind of now to bring Gaza back into play. And this is, you know, we talked a bit about Palestinian weaknesses and faults, and I think one of the questions about, and Ambassador Ross said, you know, the EU needs to be harder on the Palestinians, and I totally agree. I think we should have a robust conversation with Palestinians. I think the question is much more about, what is that conversation supposed to be about? Is it about, you know, about allegations that we hear from Israel about incitement, about curriculums and funding, and not to say these aren't warranted discussions, but should that be the focus, which it currently is, and that is currently what European interlocutors are talking to Palestinians about? Or do we talk to Palestinians about, you know, other issues, about the complete lack of reconciliation, reunification, the Palestinian leadership's drift towards authoritarianism, let's be quite frank, and de-democratization, you know, the fact that it's dissolved the Palestinian Legislative Council. You know, I think these are also, you know, whether we're in the current two-state paradigm or another paradigm, these remain of utmost importance. And I think, you know, if you want to move forward for a peace process, whatever it is, or if you want to make progress on Gaza, or if you want to make progress on redemocratization, you know, Palestinian unity is an overriding factor. And I think it's, you know, the Palestinians have to lead on that. But I think, you know, we should also, as Europeans and hopefully Americans, can also try to play a more supportive role, while knowing that also our own policies, like in 2006, and our own lack of recognition of the elections at the time, the legislative elections, you know, contributed to the current situation. So I'm not sure how much I answered the question, but I think that's when we talk about Gaza, you know, we have to appreciate there's a much broader political context.
For one, and Ambassador Ross, I'd add one more question. From which countries we could expect a harder approach toward Israel? I mean, what would be, let me follow up on this way, how would be the reaction of the Arab world? Would, for instance, Iran Hamas, Hezbollah would gain some room because of the annexation? Marwan.
I wouldn't place much value, frankly, on the Arab world. The Arab world is either engaged in its own domestic issues or because of the Gulf states' opposition to Iranian policy have decided to cooperate with Israel, even at the expense of a solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict. So I don't expect that the Arab world is going to move unanimously on this issue. The last time the Arab world really did something which I think is still very useful, and I want to answer Dennis here, is the Arabs did come up with their own plan. They presented an Arab peace initiative, and it was a collective plan, not just by the Palestinians, but by 22 Arab states. They did not offer peace to Israel just by the Palestinians, but peace and security and an end to the conflict by all Arab states, 22 Arab states. So it's not fair to say that the Arabs did not come up with, or the Palestinians with their own plan. But that's, I don't want to engage in these arguments. I don't think Israel is going to be deterred at all, except by the United States. There's nobody else that can place that kind of pressure. The King Abdullah of Jordan has been very active the last week in talking to members of Congress on both sides of the aisle, Democrat and Republican, and explaining to them the dangers of annexation. Yesterday, I think, 200 members of Congress signed, from the Democratic Party, signed a letter to the president urging him not to go ahead with annexation because of the issues that we have been discussing today. So that kind of pressure might work. And of course, if Biden wins the elections in November, we might see a totally different atmosphere than the present one. But I do not think that international pressure is going to make much difference on Israel if the United States continues to support Israeli annexation.
Thank you. Ambassador Ross.
Well, I think, look, a couple points. One, I just want to answer one thing that Hugh said. When I'm talking about counter proposals, and this applies to Marwan as well, I'm focused on that would get the Trump administration to say no. And what they're conveying is if there's a counter proposal, then there's an engagement on their plan, and therefore they will say no to annexation. So I too am focused on how do you head off annexation. I think that's the most important thing. And one other point on Hugh, look, I think it is important to have these, as you put, robust conversations with the Palestinians. And I think it's fair to cover a range of issues. I think the authoritarian nature of what goes on both in the West Bank and in Gaza needs to be part of your conversations. And I would say, as for the Arab world, again, I think Anwar Sadat once said when he made peace with Israel, it's because the United States had 99% of the cards. I do think we're looking at what is primarily, if the Trump administration says no, annexation doesn't go ahead. That isn't to say that you can't have some impact. You had the UAE ambassador to the United States, Minister of State as well, Yusuf Otaiba, do an article and a video related to the article in one of Israel's leading newspapers, and it created quite a stir within Israel. So reaching out to the Israeli public may actually feed the debate that is emerging now in Israel, and could bolster those within the government, meaning Gantz and Ashkenazi, to take the position that, look, we don't think even going ahead with any annexation, no matter how small, makes sense. I don't know if interviews with Israel TV right now, spelling out why this is deeply problematic and will have consequences. There is, I think, value in that if it comes from those in the Arab world who are not seen at this point as being hostile towards Israel in the same way. The reason Otaiba had such an effect was he actually, in his article, talked about Israel was seen as an opportunity, not as an enemy, but that you couldn't have annexation and normalization. it's a powerful message and it had an effect. So I wouldn't give up on this at this point.
Sure. Well, in conclusion, allow me to come back to the beginning. I don't know if my question is a thought or a bet, but so we had what Bibi will do starting from July 1st. To start the annexation, postpone, reduce, or cancel it. I start with Hugh. Last questions. It's a bet. I understand.
Yeah,
it's a
my bet would
basically.
be for now, he'll go forward with reduced annexation, starting with some of the major settlement blocks. I'm sure try to frame that in a nice way that's acceptable to the international community, as this is like still preserving the potential for a future agreement and down the line. But at the same time, trying to sell that to the settlers by saying, this is just the first step, and it doesn't, prejudice future annexations of larger chunks of the West Bank territory. So that would be my bet.
Sure. Ambassador.
My bet would be similar to Hugh. I don't think it'll be July 1. I think this is going to be delayed, but I think he will try to do it prior to September 1. And I think it will be framed pretty much the way Hugh has described. If he really wanted to try to make the position seem more acceptable, he could say Menachem Begin in December of 1981 extended Israeli law and administration to the Golan Heights, and yet 3 prime ministers, including Netanyahu, negotiated, meaning Rabin, Barak, and Netanyahu, negotiated not just the future, the readiness to negotiate its borders, and meaning even withdrawal, not even, meaning withdrawal. So he could say that precedent applies to this if he was really trying to make this seem A, more acceptable, and B, less definitive. But I suspect he won't say that. I suspect he will say something very much along the lines that Hugh was describing.
Thank you.
By September 1, not in July.
Yeah, I again agree that first of all, canceling it is out of the question for Bibi. He's not in a position to cancel annexation. He will go for a reduced annexation, as my 2 colleagues have said. But I will add that in order to appease the settler community in Israel, and they're big supporters of his, and they're not very critical of how he is going ahead with annexation, he will go with reduced annexation, but he will also tell them, this is not part of the Trump plan. This is not going to be, coupled with recognition of the Palestinian state. The Palestinian state is not in the cards now, just reduced annexation.
Thank you very much. So I'm impressed by the quality, business-like, the short but rich assessments you made. Marwan Muasher, Dennis Ross, Hugh Glover. I do really thank you very much and hope to see you soon for another webinar, maybe in flesh and blood, inshallah. Thank you very much indeed, and good luck.
Thanks for having us.